I know why you clicked, boys. You saw that pretty young thing stretched out on the bunk, and that G I standing right there in front of her. And knowing you fellas the way I do, I know exactly where your mind went in that first second. Hell, after 8 months humping through the jungle, any one of us would have thought the same damn thing. But here's the thing. Don't go in without protection. In 1966 out in Binh Duong province meant something entirely different from what you're thinking right now. It meant a rubber mask strapped tight to your face, a canister on your back, and the prayer to every god you ever heard of. Because what Charlie was pumping into those tunnels turned a man's lungs into a wet rag in about 30 seconds flat. And the boys from the American infantry were going in there without that protection. Over and over again, not because they were stupid, but because the brass never gave it to them. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. So settle in, pour yourself something worth drinking, and let's go back to those green, suffocating jungles. Because the story I'm about to tell you is a story about courage. The kind of courage that doesn't get monuments built in Washington. It's about the grunts who went into the darkest, tightest, most terrifying holes in the earth, armed with a flashlight, a pistol, and whatever guts God gave them at birth. And it's about a group of quiet, patient, almost frighteningly calm Australians who looked at the same problem and said, "Mate, there's a smarter way to do this." But before we get to the diggers and their particular brand of bushcraft genius, we need to understand just how bad it got down in those tunnels. Because unless you understand the full nightmare of what those American kids were walking into, you can't truly appreciate the magnitude of the mistake that was being made at every level above them. The Cu Chi Tunnel Complex. If you've never heard those 3 words spoken with a kind of quiet dread, then you haven't spent enough time reading about this war. By 1966, the Viet Cong had constructed over 250 kilometers of tunnels beneath the red clay soil of Binh Duong province, just northwest of Saigon. 250 kilometers, boys. That's roughly the distance from New York City to Boston. All of it underground. All of it hand-dug. All of it designed with one single purpose: to make the most powerful military machine on the face of the earth look slow, blind, and stupid. And for a while, it worked. The tunnels weren't just holes in the ground. They were cities. They had hospitals down there, kitchens, armories, printing presses churning out propaganda, meeting rooms where VC commanders planned operations that would kill American boys sleeping in their fire bases miles away. There were trapdoors disguised so perfectly you could stand on one and never know it. There were false passages that led nowhere, or worse, led directly into a booby trap that would take your hand off at the wrist. There were underwater entrances, ventilation shafts hidden inside termite mounds, chambers that could be flooded or filled with smoke at a moment's notice. Charlie had been digging since the late 1940s. By the time American boots hit Vietnamese soil in force, he'd had nearly 20 years to perfect his underground world. And when the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, rolled into Binh Duong with their M48 tanks and their artillery and their helicopters and all that magnificent, thunderous American firepower, Charlie simply went underground and waited. You can't bomb what you can't see. You can't shell what's 30 feet below the surface. And you sure as hell can't send a helicopter gunship into a tunnel. So somebody in the brass had an idea. A predictably terrible idea, as it turned out. Send the men in. Now let me be absolutely clear about something, because I will not have anyone misunderstand what I'm saying here. The men who volunteered, and many of them did volunteer, to go into those tunnels were among the bravest human beings who ever wore a uniform. We're talking about young men, 19, 20, 21 years old, who would crawl headfirst into a black hole in the ground, knowing full well that somewhere in the darkness ahead of them, there might be a man with a knife, a tripwire connected to a grenade, a bamboo spike smeared with God knows what, or something far worse. The courage required to do that is not something most people can even conceive of sitting in their living rooms, watching the evening news. These men, the tunnel rats as they came to be called, were something special. Officially, they were members of various engineer and infantry units. Unofficially, they were a brotherhood unto themselves. Small men were preferred, because the tunnels averaged about 2.5 feet wide and maybe 3 feet high in many sections. A big corn-fed Iowa farm boy couldn't even fit his shoulders through some of those passages. So they sent in the smaller guys, Puerto Ricans, Filipinos, smaller-framed Southern boys, armed with a .38 caliber pistol, a flashlight, and a combat knife. That was it. That was your kit for going into the most dangerous real estate on the planet. No communications equipment that worked underground. No backup that could reach you in time if things went wrong. No protective gear to speak of. And this is where the criminal negligence of the brass begins to show its face. No adequate protection against what Charlie had started doing to his tunnels by late 1965 and into 1966. Gas. Not the kind of large-scale chemical warfare that haunted the old veterans of the Western Front. This was cruder, more intimate, and in some ways more terrifying, precisely because of how simple it was. The Viet Cong had figured out, and give them credit because they were resourceful beyond belief, that they could use smoke, toxic fumes from burning materials, even CS gas captured from American forces, to turn their own tunnel networks into killing chambers at will. They would seal off sections, pump in smoke or fumes through dedicated ventilation shafts they controlled, and then wait. An American soldier would enter a tunnel that looked clear. He'd move forward 30, 40, 50 feet into the darkness, and then the air would change. A smell, sometimes sweet, sometimes acrid, sometimes almost nothing at all. And then the burning would start. Eyes first, then the throat. Then the lungs would begin to seize up, and a man would realize, in the most terrifying way imaginable, that he needed to go back the way he came right now. Except his body was no longer entirely cooperating with that instruction. Men died in those tunnels without a mark on them. Men came out half-conscious, retching, with burst blood vessels in their eyes, permanently damaged lungs, and the look on their faces that their buddies described as something they never wanted to see again. And what did the brass do? Well, at first they did what the brass always does when confronted with a problem that doesn't fit neatly into the field manual. They wrote a report. Then they wrote another report about the first report. Then somebody in Saigon had a meeting about the reports. Meanwhile, back out in Bin Xuan, the tunnel rats kept going in with their flashlights and their .38s and their prayers, into tunnels that were increasingly being prepared as gas traps. The protective gear existed. Proper respirators, self-contained breathing apparatus, SCBA units, were available through military supply channels. The British had developed solid protocols for confined space operations with atmospheric hazards going back to World War II. There was institutional knowledge sitting in filing cabinets in Washington about exactly this kind of scenario. But getting that knowledge, that equipment, that doctrine, translated into actual gear on the backs of actual soldiers in the field, that's where the machine broke down. Because the machine was busy. The machine was focused on body counts and free fire zones and the weekly statistics that got briefed to Secretary McNamara in his air-conditioned office. The machine was running search and destroy operations that looked impressive on paper and accomplished roughly what a man accomplishes swinging a sledgehammer at a fog bank. The grunts on the ground, they knew. The tunnel rats knew. The sergeants who watched their men come out of those holes knew. But knowing and having the authority and the supply chain to fix it were three very different things in the United States Army of 1966. There's a particular kind of frustration that military men of a certain generation understand in their bones. It's the frustration of being absolutely right about something that is getting people killed, and watching the information travel up the chain of command and somehow never travel back down in the form of solutions. You write it up. Your sergeant writes it up. Your lieutenant passes it along. Your captain agrees with you completely. And somewhere above the captain, in that rarefied atmosphere where men wear more stars than they've spent nights in the field, it gets translated into a priority item for the next quarterly review. Meanwhile, somebody's boy from Ohio doesn't come home. Now, let's talk about the Australians. The 1st Australian Task Force, the ATF, operated out of Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy province, not far from the coastal town of Vung Tau. If you were an American GI with any sense at all, you'd heard about Vung Tau. Beautiful beaches, cold beer, the kind of R&R that made you remember why life was worth the trouble of staying alive. But that's a story we'll get back to in a few minutes. The Australians brought with them something that the American military, for all its colossal power and resources, sometimes struggled to deploy effectively. And that was patience. Deep, almost inhuman patience. The kind of patience that gets bred into a man who grows up in a country where the land itself is trying to kill you, and has been doing so since before his grandfather's grandfather was born. The Australian SAS, the Special Air Service Regiment, were not like other soldiers. They didn't look like soldiers, half the time. They moved through the jungle in 4- and 6-man patrols so quietly that Vietnamese villagers who were later interviewed said they sometimes didn't know the Australians had been in their area at all. They called them the Phantoms. They called them the Jungle Ghosts. Charlie called them something rather less complimentary, but the sentiment was similar. These were men who belonged to the bush in a way that was deeply unsettling to encounter. Where the American approach to the tunnel problem was, broadly speaking, to find the tunnels and then send brave young men into them, the Australian approach began several steps earlier. It began with intelligence, with observation, with the patient, meticulous business of watching and learning before acting. The Australian SAS patrols operating in areas where tunnel networks were suspected would spend days, sometimes the better part of a week, simply watching, mapping foot traffic, noting where the ground was disturbed in patterns that didn't match natural erosion, observing which termite mounds seemed slightly too regular in their construction, watching the way smoke moved through the jungle canopy at certain times of day when it really shouldn't have been moving at all. They were building a picture. And when the picture was complete enough, when they understood not just where the tunnels were, but how they were ventilated, where the exits were, what the routine of the occupants looked like, then they acted. And they acted with a precision that the sledgehammer approach simply could not replicate. The Australians had also, Through a combination of proper pre-deployment training and the kind of institutional common sense that comes from not having 17 layers of bureaucracy between the man on the ground and the man making decisions, equipped their tunnel clearance personnel properly. Respirators, proper lighting equipment, communications that actually functioned at the distances involved. Protocols for atmospheric testing before entry that would have seemed elementary to any mining engineer, but apparently required considerable time to percolate through the American military supply system. They also, and this is the part that I find most impressive, because it speaks to a fundamental difference in military philosophy, they also had a doctrine of not going in at all if going in wasn't necessary. If you could map the tunnel system from the outside, identify all the exits, and then introduce CS gas or smoke through the ventilation system in a controlled way, and simply wait for whatever was inside to make a choice, come out or don't, then you did that. You didn't send a man into a gas-filled hole because it was the only tool you had available. Options. The Australians always tried to maintain options. There's a story that made the rounds among American GIs stationed near Vung Tau in the summer of 1967. And I can't swear to every detail, but I've heard enough versions of it from enough different directions that I believe the bones of it are true. A patrol from the Big Red One had been working an area just outside their operational boundary, closer to the Australian sector than they were strictly supposed to be. They'd found a tunnel entrance, well camouflaged, recently used, the kind that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up because you knew somebody was home. Standard procedure called for a tunnel rat to go in and clear it. The tunnel rat they had with them that day was a young corporal from somewhere in New Jersey, 20 years old, maybe 140 pounds soaking wet, exactly the kind of kid the job attracted. He'd done it before. He knew the drill. But something felt wrong that day. The corporal stood at the entrance and sniffed the air and said something that his sergeant remembered word for word years later at a veterans reunion in Atlanta. He said, "Sarge, the air coming out of there smells like the back of my grandfather's garage when the car's been running too long." Carbon monoxide. The kid didn't know the chemistry, but his nose knew something was off. His sergeant, to his eternal credit, told him to hold. They marked the entrance and pulled back. And that evening, at a forward operating base, they ran into a 4-man Australian SAS patrol that had been ghosting through the same general area for the better part of 5 days. The kind of Australians who looked like they'd been assembled from spare parts left over from making something tougher than ordinary men. Lean, quiet, with eyes that moved constantly and registered everything and gave away nothing. The American sergeant bought them a beer, Ba Moi Ba, the local brew that tasted roughly like what you'd get if you asked someone to describe beer to you and they'd never actually tried it. But after enough weeks in the field, it tasted like the finest thing on earth. And he described the tunnel entrance and what his corporal had smelled. The Australian who seemed to be in charge, a staff sergeant who hadn't offered his name, and nobody had pressed him for it, listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very calmly, "Yeah, don't go in that one, mate. Not without gear. They've been cooking something in there, and they vented it into the forward chambers. We've seen it before. They'll do it when they know you're in the area, and they want to leave you a present." He said it the way a man says something completely obvious, the way a plumber tells you not to touch a pipe that's clearly under pressure. Just a flat, matter-of-fact statement of reality, delivered without drama. Because drama was for people who hadn't spent enough time paying attention to the world trying to kill them. Then the Australian reached into his kit and pulled out something that the American sergeant had never seen before. A small, simple, atmospheric testing device. The kind of thing that miners had been carrying into shafts for decades. He explained how it worked, what readings to watch for, what the different smells meant and what they didn't mean, and how to use smoke to map a ventilation system before you committed a man to going inside it. The American sergeant listened to all of this, and then, according to the story, he said something along the lines of, "How long have you boys known about this?" And the Australian looked at him with that particular expression that men wear when they're being polite about the fact that the answer to your question is going to be uncomfortable. And he said, "A while, mate." A while. That conversation, or something very much like it, because this kind of exchange happened in various forms throughout the Australian-American operational relationship in Vietnam. That conversation represents something important. It represents the difference between an army that was learning in real time, on the ground, through the brutal and expensive process of watching its own men get hurt, and an army that had done its homework before the bell rang. Now, I am not here to bury the American military. I want to be very clear about that. The men of the 1st Infantry Division, the 25th Infantry Division, the 173rd Airborne, these were warriors. These were men of extraordinary courage who faced an enemy unlike anything their training had fully prepared them for, in terrain unlike anything most of them had ever seen, in a war that their own government couldn't decide how to fight, or even how to define. They adapted. They learned. They developed the Tunnel Rat program essentially from scratch, in the field, without a manual, because there was no manual. They wrote the manual with their own blood and their own hard-won experience. But there is a difference between the courage of men who do difficult things because they have no choice, and the wisdom of an institution that equips its men properly so that courage doesn't have to substitute for preparation. And in the matter of the tunnels, specifically in the matter of gas-filled tunnels and the protection of the men sent to clear them, the American military system failed its grunts for a period that was far too long and cost far too much. The tunnel rats themselves knew it. There are interviews, recorded decades later, when these men were in their 50s and 60s and had the distance to speak plainly, where they describe the equipment situation with a kind of measured, weary disgust that is more damning than anger would be. One former tunnel rat, speaking at a reunion in the late 1990s, put it this way, and I'm paraphrasing here because I want to get the feeling right, even if I can't give you the exact words. He said that they went into those tunnels with what they had, because what they had was what they were given. And what they were given was not enough. And everybody knew it was not enough. And they went in anyway, because that's what soldiers do. But he said it made him angry. Not the going in, not the danger, not even the ones who didn't come back out. It made him angry that it didn't have to be that way. That anger is legitimate. That anger is earned. And any man who spent time in those tunnels without proper respiratory protection has the absolute right to carry that anger for the rest of his life. By 1967 and into 1968, the American military did begin to address the equipment shortfalls. Proper respirators started making their way into the hands of tunnel clearance teams. Protocols were developed and disseminated. The hard lessons were being written into doctrine. The way hard lessons always eventually get written into doctrine. Just usually a beat or two later than you'd like, when you're the one on the pointy end of the problem. And through all of it, out in Phuoc Tuy province, the Australians kept doing what they'd been doing from the beginning. Quiet patrols. Patient observation, Precise, calculated action. No fanfare, no press releases. The diggers were not a people who felt the need to announce themselves. They did their work, and they went back to Nui Dat, and they cleaned their weapons, and they slept when they could sleep, and they drank when there was something to drink. And they didn't talk much about what they'd seen, unless they were among men who'd seen the same things. There's a kind of mutual respect that develops between fighting men of different nations when they operate in the same theater, and they're honest enough to recognize quality in each other. The Americans and Australians in Vietnam had that. The grunts, anyway. The men on the ground. They looked at each other and they recognized something familiar, something that transcended the differences in doctrine and equipment and military culture. They recognized men who were doing a hard job in hard circumstances with everything they had. The bars of Vung Tau were where a lot of that mutual recognition got expressed, usually over those ice-cold bottles of Ba Moi Ba, or sometimes over something stronger if you knew where to look. Vung Tau in those years was a strange and wonderful and slightly unreal place. The South China Sea right there, blue and clean-looking, in a way that made you forget for a few hours everything behind you and everything waiting for you when R&R was over. There were restaurants that managed to produce food that reminded you dimly of home. There were bars where the music was too loud and the lighting was too low, and nobody asked you too many questions, which was exactly the way you wanted it. American G's and Australian diggers would end up at the same tables often enough that it stopped being a surprise. And the conversations that happened at those tables, once enough Ba Moi Ba had been consumed to loosen things up, those conversations were where a lot of real knowledge transfer happened. Not in briefing rooms, not in official liaison meetings. In bars, over beer, the way soldiers have always actually shared what they know with each other since the first armies ever took the field. An American grunt would describe a problem he'd been having with tunnels, with ambushes, with the particular way Charlie moved through the jungle in his area of operations. And an Australian would listen and then say something quiet and specific and useful, and vice versa. The Australians weren't perfect. They had their own blind spots, their own institutional stubbornness, their own moments where the doctrine didn't match the reality on the ground. They were human beings, operating in an enormously complex and dangerous situation, same as everyone else. But in the specific matter of the tunnels and the gas, in the matter of understanding the environment before committing men to it, of treating the question of protection as a logistical and tactical priority rather than an afterthought, they had worked some things out that the American system was slower to arrive at. And the men who benefited from those barroom conversations, who went back to their units and quietly started doing things a little differently, based on what a laconic Australian staff sergeant had told them over a beer in Vung Tau, those men very possibly went home when they might not have otherwise. That matters. That matters more than any official history or any body count statistic or any congressional hearing. That a kid from New Jersey came home because somebody shared what they knew over a beer in a bar by the South China Sea? That matters. The tunnels of Cu Chi are a tourist attraction now. I want you to sit with that for a second. They've widened some of the passages so that Western tourists can crawl through them. They sell tickets. There are guides who explain the history in cheerful, practiced English. People take photographs of themselves crouching in the darkness and post them on the internet and feel like they've had an adventure. I don't begrudge anyone their tourism. The world turns and history becomes monument, and monument becomes attraction. And that's how it goes. But if you're a man of a certain age watching this, If you or someone you loved spent time in that red clay soil and that suffocating green heat, then you know that those tunnels are something that no tourist experience can touch. You know what it smelled like down there. You know what the silence sounded like when it had a particular quality that meant it wasn't empty silence. You know the specific weight of a flashlight in one hand and a .38 in the other, and the specific quality of darkness that exists 30 feet underground in a tunnel the width of your shoulders. And you know the particular courage it took to keep moving forward anyway. The tunnel rats of the United States Army were never officially recognized as a distinct unit. They had no official patch, no official designation, no formal acknowledgement from the military machine that what they were doing was categorically different from ordinary infantry work. They organized themselves. They developed their own informal standards and their own informal brotherhood. They looked after each other in the way that men who share extreme danger always look after each other, across every army and every war in history. Many of them came home with lungs that weren't quite right, with hearing that wasn't quite right, because the confined space amplified weapons fire to a degree that permanent damage was almost inevitable, with a relationship with enclosed spaces that required management for the rest of their lives, with memories that didn't file neatly away the way you hoped memories would. And most of them, never talked about it much. Not to civilians, anyway. What would you say? How do you explain to someone who's never been closer to mortal danger than a fender bender on the interstate what it means to crawl through a tunnel that might be full of gas, or might have a man with a knife around the next bend, or might simply end in a deadfall into a pit of sharpened stakes? You don't, mostly. You come home and you get on with it, and you carry it the way your generation learned to carry things, quietly, without making a fuss, because making a fuss wasn't something that had been modeled for you as a viable option. So let me say something directly to any man watching this who went into those tunnels, with whatever gear he had or didn't have, in whatever province, in whatever year. What you did required a quality of courage that most human beings will never be asked to demonstrate. The failures of the system that sent you in under-equipped are real, and the anger about those failures is legitimate. And none of that diminishes by one single inch what you personally brought to that darkness every time you went in. You were not let down by your country. You were let down by a bureaucratic machine that moved too slowly and prioritized the wrong things. Your country, the actual human beings of your country, owes you more than it has generally found ways to express. And to the Australian diggers who figured some of this out earlier and who shared what they knew with American counterparts whenever they had the chance, quietly, without ceremony, the way professionals share knowledge. Thank you. That's not a small thing. In the specific calculus of those years, in that specific theater, that kind of knowledge sharing was measured in lives. So here's what I want to ask you, fellas, because you're the ones who actually know. Whether you were in country, or whether you've spent the years since studying this war the way some men study scripture, what's your read on the tunnel situation? Do you think the American military learned fast enough, given how new the whole problem was? Or was there a point where the system should have caught up faster than it did? And for those of you who had any contact with the Australians over there, at Vung Tau, at joint operations, anywhere, what was your impression of how they operated? Write it in the comments, boys. Let's hear from the people who were actually there, or who've done the reading. Because the history books give you the broad strokes. But the real texture of what happened in those tunnels and those jungles and those bars by the South China Sea, that lives in the memory of the men who were present for it. And that memory deserves to be on the record before it fades. This one's for the tunnel rats. All of them. Every last one.